We headed out on a camping trip to Barrowman State Park. Just me, Kyle, and Jesse, 3 guys trying to get away from city life for a couple of days. We had been planning it for a while, packed up all our stuff, and drove out of Queens on a Friday afternoon. When we got there, the park was really quiet. We pitched our tents by one of the smaller ponds, a spot we chose off the map because it was pretty far from any main trails. By the time we finished setting up the tent and got a fire going, it was already starting to get dark. But that first night was great. We roasted hot dogs, had a few beers, and caught up. It had been months since we all hung out properly. The next morning, we decided to explore some trails. It was almost noon, and we didn't really have a plan. We just followed one path until it faded out, then kept on walking. My buddy Jesse had his phone out, taking pictures of mushrooms and random rocks, while Kyle kept talking about finding a nice spot to have lunch. I just tagged along, half listening to them argue about whether Bigfoot could live in New York. After a couple hours, the trees started thinning out, and we stumbled onto a small pond that wasn't marked on our map. It wasn't very big, probably less than 100 yards across. Near the edge, there was this old wooden shed. There wasn't much to it. The wood was this faded, grayish-brown color, cracked and splintered like it had been standing there for who knows how many decades. The roof sagged in the middle, and there wasn't any glass left in the one small window, just an open square with a torn bit of curtain blowing in the breeze. The door hung half open, swinging a little whenever the wind caught it. Kyle said it looked abandoned, and Jesse agreed. I wasn't so sure, though. Something about it didn't feel right. But we were curious, so we went to check it out. Inside, it was dark, with just a little bit of light coming through the window. The air smelled thick, like damp dirt and rotting wood. There wasn't much inside. A wooden table in the center, a couple of busted chairs tipped over in the corners, and some old rusty nails sticking out from the walls. The table grabbed my attention first. It was rough and splintered, stained with dark patches, almost black in the low light. I ran my hand across one of the stains, but couldn't tell what it was. Jesse joked that it was probably blood. Kyle nodded, pointing at the walls, which had about a dozen hooks screwed in at different heights. Some of them were bent or rusted, but they were all empty. No ropes or tools or anything hanging from them. It made sense to think maybe a hunter had used the place at some point, maybe to clean deer or whatever. That's what we kept telling ourselves anyway. It was creepy, sure, but not totally beyond reason. We poked around for a few minutes. Kyle kicked at the curtain, and Jesse snapped a picture of the table, saying he'd show it to his cousin who hunted upstate. I stood by the doorway, pretty much ready to head back. The shack felt wrong to me. When we stepped outside, I was glad to breathe in the fresh pond air again. We started heading back toward where we thought the trail was, planning to go back to camp and grab something to eat. That's when Kyle tripped. He was a few steps ahead of me, walking near the side of the shack, when his foot caught on something. He flailed his arms but didn't fall. Jesse and I caught up and we saw it. Something metal sticking out of the dirt, just an inch or two above the ground. It was dull, rusted in spots, and half buried. At first, I thought it might be a knife or a hatchet, something a hunter had dropped and left behind. Kyle crouched down, brushed some dirt off it, but it wouldn't budge. Jesse handed me his water bottle and told us to dig it out. I grabbed a stick and started scraping at the dirt while Kyle dug with his hands, tossing clumps of earth aside. The more we dug, the bigger it got. It wasn't a tool, that much was obvious. There was a curved edge, then another, and after about 10 minutes, we had it mostly unearthed. It was a helmet or something shaped like one. The metal was thick, probably iron, covered in pits and rust, but still heavy and solid. It was tall and came to a point at the top, almost like a pyramid. In the front, there were 2 cross-shaped slits for eyes. Not neat crosses like you'd see at a church, but rough, uneven ones, like someone hacked them out with a chisel. The whole thing was bizarre. It didn't belong there, and just looking at it gave me the chills. Jesse took a step back, asking what it was. Kyle picked it up, grunting a little at how much it weighed, and held it out. "Looks like a clan hood," he joked, "but made out of metal." I didn't think it was that. As far as I knew, the clan didn't wear metal pyramid helmets. It felt older, heavier, like it was made for something worse than just show. Kyle turned it over, looking inside, and said it smelled like rust and dirt. Then he smiled and said, "I'm gonna put it on." "No, you're not," Jesse said, grabbing it from him and sitting down to wipe his hands on his jeans. "At least clean it first." Kyle shrugged, but I could tell he was serious about trying it on later. I didn't like it. That helmet gave me a bad feeling, like it was staring at us through those cross-shaped holes. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to sound crazy. We left the helmet there by the shack and headed back to camp. The hike back was quiet, nobody said much. We mostly kept our eyes on the ground. By the time we got to our tents, the sun was setting. We built another fire, cooked some pasta on the camp stove, and ate it with Jared sauce. We talked a little, but eventually the helmet came up again. Jesse said it was probably some weird art project or maybe a leftover prop from a movie shoot. Kyle didn't think so. He said it was way too heavy for that. "And why bury it?" he asked. I didn't have a good answer. I kept thinking about those stains on the table, the hooks on the walls. That shack didn't seem like a hunter's spot anymore. Not with that thing outside. But we let it go. We finished eating and sat by the fire until it burned down to just glowing embers. It was after dark, maybe 9 or 10, when Kyle suddenly stood up. Without saying anything, he grabbed his flashlight and started walking toward the trees. "Where are you going?" I called after him. He didn't answer. He just kept walking. Jesse and I looked at each other. "He's going for the helmet," Jesse said, and I nodded. We could have stopped him, but we didn't. Kyle was gone longer than it should have taken to walk to the shack and back. Jesse started pacing around the fire, muttering about how stupid Kyle was to go off alone. I just sat there poking at the fire with a stick, trying not to think about that helmet lying out there in the dark. When Kyle finally came back, he was empty-handed. He looked pale and wouldn't meet our eyes. Jesse asked him what happened. Kyle sat down on a log and stared at the ground. "I threw it," he said, "out into the woods somewhere. Didn't want it looking at me." Jesse asked what he meant by that, but Kyle didn't explain. He just shook his head. Jesse kept pressing, but Kyle stayed silent. He looked genuinely scared, like he had seen something he couldn't explain. We didn't push anymore. The fire was almost dead anyway, and none of us wanted to stay up much longer. We crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. I lay awake for a while, listening to the wind outside and Kyle's uneven breathing. I kept picturing that helmet, those cross-shaped eye slits, somewhere out there in the woods, staring into the dark. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us said it out loud, but we all wanted to leave. The drive back was quiet, just the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional car passing by. We didn't talk about the shack. We didn't talk about the helmet. Not then and not later, but it stayed with me. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about it. About that shack, those dark stains, the hooks on the walls, and that strange thing buried under the dirt. It didn't feel like a hunter's tool. It didn't feel like a prop. It felt like something worse. Something none of us were supposed to find. Years later, I even tried looking up Barrowman State Park online, just to see if anyone else had stumbled across that shack. I didn't find anything, just trail maps and a few camper reviews. No mention of a hidden pond with a shed. No mention of a buried helmet. Maybe we wandered farther off the path than we realized. Maybe it's still out there, rusting away where Kyle threw it. I don't know. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. Whatever that thing was, I'm glad we left it behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still see those rough cross slits in my mind and wonder if we walked away from something far worse than we'll ever know. I had been counting down the days for that camping trip for a while. Myself, Jesse, and Logan, my buddies, had put it together. Nothing big or fancy. It was just supposed to be a night out in the woods. We picked a spot way off the beaten path out in Kentucky, somewhere deep in the backwoods where the trees grew thick and the roads were nothing but dirt, and it was just us, our tent, a few beers, and a fire. It was all real simple, the kind of thing we'd done 100 times growing up. I figured it would be Good time, and it was until the morning we showed up late in the day, the sun already starting to sink, and we set up camp fast, pitched the tent, grabbed some firewood, and got a fire going. The night went smooth, and the woods were real quiet. We sat around drinking and laughing, just hanging out with the crackle of the fire for company, and it felt good being out there away from work and the noise of town. And when I woke up, the fire was down to just a few glowing coals, and the sky was a dull gray, and you could see the first light of morning starting to come in. Jesse and Logan were still passed out, so I crawled out of the tent, stretched my legs, and figured I'd get some coffee going. I walked over to my SUV to grab the coffee pot out the back, and that's when I saw it. There was a hide, some kind of animal skin, stretched out across the hood of my SUV. It wasn't thrown there either, it was laid out real neat, like someone had taken their time with it. The fur was gone, scraped clean off, and the underside was raw and pink, just slick, and wet blood had dripped down the windshield, thick and dark, already starting to dry at the edges. I couldn't tell what it was, maybe a deer, maybe something smaller. The head was missing, and the legs were hacked off rough, like they'd been chopped with a dull knife, and it stank, that sour, rotten smell that gets up in your nose and doesn't leave, and all I could do was stand there staring at it while my hands started to shake. I looked around, half thinking I'd see someone nearby watching me, but the woods were dead still. No birds, no breeze, nothing, just me and that thing on my SUV. I kicked the tent hard to wake Jesse and Logan, and they stumbled out groggy, but when they saw it, their faces drained white. We didn't talk much, we didn't have to. It was clear something wasn't right. We tore down camp fast, threw everything in the back. Without even folding it up, I grabbed a branch and used it to shove that skin off the hood. It hit the dirt with a wet slap, and I didn't look at it again. We jumped in, and I floored it down the dirt road, tires kicking up dust, and the whole way I kept checking the mirror like something might be chasing us, but there wasn't anything there, and I couldn't shake the feeling though. And we didn't really say anything on the drive back. Jesse just stared out his window, and Logan kept messing with his fingers, picking at the skin, and I just stared at the road, trying to keep my mind blank and forget whatever we left back there. And when we got back to town, we split up quick. I went home, washed the blood off my SUV with a hose, and just stood there watching the red swirl down the driveway. It didn't even feel real, but my gut wouldn't settle. And later that day, I started asking around to see if anyone had heard anything. This old guy, Mr. Dalton, who worked at the gas station, gave me a weird look when I brought it up, and he said he'd heard stories about folks finding skinned animals left on cars or porches way out in the woods. Said it had been happening off and on for years. No one knew who was doing it, but most figured it was some kind of warning, a message to people who didn't belong. Dalton said he saw it once himself back in the late 70s when he camped too far out, woke up to find a skinned rabbit laid across his cooler, and he never went back out there again. I didn't sleep much that night, just kept thinking about that hide, how carefully it had been stretched out. And later I got online and started digging. I found posts from all over, same kind of thing, skinned animals left in the middle of the night, always out in remote places. Some people said it was hunters gone crazy or bored kids. Others thought it was something older, something tied to the land. One guy said he saw shapes moving through the trees after it happened to him, but he didn't stick around to find out. And the more I read, the worse it got. People talked about feeling watched after hearing noises back home, like whatever did it wasn't finished with them. And I kept telling myself it was just a bad joke, just someone messing around, but deep down I knew better, and I don't know who did it or what they wanted. Maybe we camped where we shouldn't have, maybe it was random, but I know it wasn't an animal that skinned that thing and laid it on my SUV. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. Jesse and Logan feel the same. We don't talk about it, but it's there just hanging over us, and I still drive that SUV, but every time I look at the hood I still see that hide. I keep the doors locked now, and I don't think that feeling's ever gonna go away. All I know is I ain't ever going back to those deep woods again. I'd always loved the outdoors, and my buddy Jake was the same. We'd been friends since we were little kids, back when we used to skip school and hang around the ravines near our neighborhood in Calgary. Over the years, that turned into a tradition. Every summer we'd pick a spot, pack light, and head out for a weekend of camping. As time went on, we realized we had to keep raising the bar to get that same rush. We came up with the term hardcore camping, though I'm sure other people have thought of the same thing. Basically, it meant no tents, no camp stoves, just ponchos, ground cloths, and whatever we could carry on our backs. We'd bring a little bit of food, but not much, so after a couple days we'd have to fish, forage, and live off the land if we wanted to eat. It wasn't supposed to be easy. That was the whole point. The year we both turned 23, we picked Banff National Park, a massive stretch of woods and lakes in Alberta, for a full week of wilderness camping. We started off strong. That first day, we hiked about 13 miles from the trailhead, moving through thick forests of spruce and aspen. The air was crisp, the sky scattered with clouds. After hiking all day, we made camp near a shallow stream. I strung my poncho over a low branch while Jake collected firewood. We had some jerky, boiled water from the creek, and sat by the fire until the stars started blinking out overhead. It was quiet, just the sound of leaves rustling and maybe an owl off in the distance. That was exactly the way we liked it. No people, no noise, just the wild. Day 2 was harder. The ground got rough, lots of rocks and tree roots, and we had to scramble up a steep ridge to keep heading north. My calves were screaming by lunchtime, and Jake, being a lot taller than me, kept pulling ahead with those long legs of his. That night, we found a flat patch of moss to sleep on, but the ground was freezing cold. I woke up once to a twig snapping nearby. Reaching for the knife, I kept close, but it turned out to just be a deer moving past in the dark. By the 3rd day, we were hitting our stride. Our packs were lighter by now, the food nearly gone, but we were used to it. Hunger always kicked us into gear. That afternoon, Jake caught a small trout using a makeshift line and hook, and we cooked it over a fire, tearing it apart with our hands. The cold stream water we drank was better than any bottled stuff. We checked the map once in a while, but mostly we let the woods lead us, trusting our instincts to find the next campsite. Banff was enormous, thousands of square miles, and we were way out in the heart of it. No roads, no ranger stations nearby. That was the whole idea. No safety nets, just us and the open wilderness. The 4th day started out like the others. Jake was already up, rolling up his ground cloth when I crawled out from under my poncho. We finished off the last bit of granola, threw on our packs, and kept heading north. The forest was thick around us, and we didn't talk much, just hiked to the rhythm of our own footsteps. Around noon, we stopped at a skinny stream to refill our canteens. I knelt down, splashed some cold water on my face, when Jake tapped my shoulder. "You see that?" he asked, pointing out into the trees. First, I didn't spot it. Then I saw it too, something that had way too many straight lines to be natural. We grabbed our packs and pushed through the undergrowth toward it. The trees started to thin out, and there it was, a building. More exactly, it was a church. The walls were old wood, sun-bleached and cracked, like they'd been standing for a century or more. The roof was steep, layered with moss and pine needles, and there was a rusted cross stuck up on top. Another cross, this one wooden, hung on the front door, which had been boarded and chained shut with a heavy lock. There was no steeple, no windows, just this battered wooden box half swallowed by the forest. I remember turning to Jake and saying something like, "What the hell?" He didn't answer, just dropped to his knees, pulled out the map, and traced our path with a finger. There was nothing marked where we were. No symbols, no hints of anything man-made for miles. It was weird, seeing a church with no roads, no trails leading to it, and nowhere near any towns or cabins. Jake folded the map up and stared hard at the building. "Let's check it out," he said. We circled around the place, stepping over roots and ducking under branches. The front door caught my eye first. The chain was thick with rust, but it didn't look like anyone had touched it in years. Then we spotted a hole in the side where the wood had rotted away, low to the ground, sharp and splintery around the edges. Just big enough for a person to crawl through. "Probably animals," Jake said, peering inside. "Maybe use it as a den." He was probably right, but when he shrugged off his pack and dropped to his knees, getting ready to crawl inside, that's when I started feeling nervous. I said something like, "You're not seriously going in there?" He just said something like, "Come on, don't you want to see?" I did want to know what was inside. I figured we could just shine our flashlights through the hole and look from outside. I suggested that, but Jake wasn't listening. He just dropped flat and started wriggling through. Couldn't let him go in there alone. So I ditched my pack and crawled in after him, scraping my shoulders on the rough wood. Inside, the air was damp and cold and smelled like mold. We stood up, brushing dirt off ourselves. The place was empty, no pews, nothing. Just 4 plain walls and a floor packed with dry leaves. At the far end was a huge wooden cross. But what stopped me was what was in the center. A metal trapdoor, half buried in the dirt, its edges bolted down and wrapped up in heavy chains, secured by a thick old padlock. I stepped closer, staring at it. The trapdoor looked solid, no scratches, no markings. Just cold, grimy steel. Jake knelt beside it, yanking on the chains. They rattled but held firm. I wondered aloud what could possibly need that much security, and Jake said maybe it wasn't a church anymore. Maybe it had been turned into a hideout. That made some sense, but for who? And for what? Jake stood up, brushing off his hands. Could be cash, he said. Smuggler's stash. Loot from a robbery. Hidden away and forgotten. That sounded like a stretch to me. I figured it could just as easily be something dangerous. Chemicals, toxic waste, something no one wanted found. I said as much, but Jake wasn't hearing me. His eyes had a wild edge to them, like he was already set on getting inside. We gotta get in there, man, he said, heading back toward the hole. Let's find something to break the chains. I yelled for him to wait, grabbed his arm, but he yanked free and crawled back out into the woods. I scrambled after him. Outside, Jake was pacing around the clearing, kicking at the ground. I asked him what he was doing, though I already knew. Looking for a rock, he said. Something big enough to smash the lock. The ground was bare though, just needles and twigs. Nothing heavy enough. I told him he was acting crazy, that even if it was something valuable, it might belong to some gang. Stealing from the wrong people could get us killed. Again, I thought I made a good point, but Jake wasn't listening. He said, "I'll hike till I find something," and marched off into the trees. That's when I snapped. I ran after him, grabbed his shoulder, spun him around, asked him what the hell was wrong with him. He shoved me back and we started shoving and wrestling. Jake might have been taller, but he was skinnier. I managed to shove him against a tree before anyone got hurt. I shouted for him to stop. Just stop. And something in him finally shifted. He froze, let go of me. We stumbled apart, both breathing hard. I asked again what was going on with him. Jake's face was pale, sweaty. He said he didn't know. I crouched down beside him, feeling the adrenaline draining out of me. Asked if he was good to keep moving. He nodded. We picked up our packs, left the church behind. But the rest of the trip didn't feel right. We camped 2 more nights, sticking to our routine, hiking, fishing, boiling water. But that spark, that excitement was gone. I kept watching Jake, waiting for that weird energy to come back. But it didn't. He was quieter than usual, but otherwise normal. By the time we hiked out and drove back to Calgary, he was joking around again like nothing had happened. We gave that church a nickname, the Cellar Stash, and turned it into some funny story to laugh over beers. But when I thought about it by myself, it never felt funny. Back home, life went back to normal. I went back to my boring office job. Jake went back to working at a warehouse. We still met up to plan trips, and whenever we did, the church would come up. Always lighthearted, always with a punchline. I'd ask him if he remembered freaking out over that trap door, and he'd grin and say, "Yeah, man, we'd be millionaires if you hadn't chickened out." We'd laugh, change the subject, but neither of us ever talked about going back. We steered clear of that part of Banff from then on. Kind of ironic, considering it was Jake who got so obsessed, not me. But over time, I realized I couldn't stop thinking about it either. Some nights, I'd lie awake, picturing that trap door, the gray wood, the rusted crosses, the thick chains. Jake had wild ideas, treasure, jewels, but I wasn't convinced. It was the summer of 1981 when the idea of taking a camping trip first came up during a conversation. Eric, a close buddy of mine since high school, had been complaining about his job for weeks. He was stuck doing a soul-draining desk job at a mortgage company, and our mutual friend Dave and I weren't in much better shape either. I was bouncing between random temp gigs, and Dave was working in a shipping warehouse, hauling boxes for close to minimum wage. We were desperate to get away from it all. Anything to break the dull cycle of work and hanging out. But none of us had enough money to fly somewhere exotic, and getting enough time off for a long road trip wasn't an option either. So after some talking, we decided camping would be our best bet. After a little more discussion, we agreed that Willard Brook State Forest would be the spot. It was only about an hour's drive west of Boston, close enough to make the trip easy but far enough out and big enough to feel like we were actually escaping into real wilderness. When I say it was big, I mean it over 2,500 acres of thick oak and pine, and it could take 6 or 7 hours to walk across it if you really pushed. We knew because we'd done a day trip there once before a couple of years back. So we figured 3 nights in late September would be just right, before the weather got too cold and rainy. We started putting a plan together once the date got closer, pooling our money to keep things cheap. My old battered red hatchback barely scraped through inspection, but it would do for the trip. Eric managed to dig out his old man's dusty two-person tent from the garage. It still held up okay, even though it had a few rough patches sewn in. Since that would only fit two, Dave brought along a little one-person tent he'd snagged from a surplus store for cheap. We split up the rest of the gear: sleeping bags, a beat-up cooler, and some simple cooking stuff, and Dave tossed in a fishing rod while I grabbed a couple of tarps in case it rained. Eric picked up a park map, one of those fold-up pamphlet types you could still grab at the visitor center. After that, we figured we were ready. I still remember the drive up being a blast. We left on a Friday afternoon with the sun still high, blasting Midnight Rider and Radar Love on the old stereo. About an hour later, we pulled into the forest just as dusk was beginning to settle. The little gravel lot near the entrance only had one other car in it. After sliding a few bucks into the pay station envelope at the tiny wooden kiosk, we picked a campsite near a place called Mill Pond. It was a nice flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, and someone had already built a solid fire ring. The ground was thick with pine needles, and through the trees about 50 yards off, we could see the pond's water shimmering in the sunset. It was stunning thinking back on it. We unloaded the car, hauled our stuff to the clearing, and started setting up camp. That first night was great. Eric got the fire going using a lighter and some crumpled up newspapers he'd brought, and we roasted hot dogs on sticks, heating up a dented old pot of beans I found in my parents' basement. It wasn't fancy food, but out there it tasted better than I could have imagined. When the food was gone, we cracked open some beers and sat on a big log we dragged over by the fire. I leaned in, staring at the flames, feeling the stress just melt away. I thought, this is exactly what I needed. The next day, we decided to go exploring. We picked a 3-mile trail that looped around the pond and up to a small overlook. The path was narrow, and the woods were alive with the sounds of leaves rustling and squirrels darting around the brush. The view from the overlook was more than worth it, the forest stretching out endlessly under the morning sun. We sat there for a while, passing a bag of trail mix back and forth, completely awestruck by how peaceful everything was. As wild and rugged as the forest looked, we felt completely safe. We shouldn't have felt that way. Sunday started the same as the others. We took a longer trail that day, getting back to camp in the late afternoon, tired but satisfied. Eric crashed for a nap in the tent while I gathered more firewood. After a simple dinner as the sun went down, we figured we'd turn in early since the hike had worn us out. Joey's tent sat like a dark lump nearby. I zipped up ours, crawled into my sleeping bag, and found Eric already snoring away. The forest grew quiet, with only the occasional rustle of an animal. Eventually, I drifted off too. I remember waking up freezing. The air inside the tent felt wrong, damp, cold, and heavy. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and saw that the tent flap was unzipped. I sat up, sweeping the light around. Eric's sleeping bag was empty. His boots were missing too, but his jacket was still wadded up in the corner. I checked my watch. It was just after 4:20 a.m. I figured he'd just wandered off to relieve himself and would be back any second. I lay there waiting, but after a minute, nothing. No sounds, no footsteps, just silence. Another minute passed. Still nothing. I sat up again, grabbed the flashlight, and shuffled toward the tent flap. I peeked outside. It was pitch black. My flashlight beam barely made a dent in the darkness. I moved it side to side, scanning the trees. No sign of Eric. I felt a little ridiculous pulling on my boots, thinking, asterisk, I'm spooking myself over nothing. He probably just wandered off a little too far. Asterisk, as I put on my jacket, I kept telling myself that I'd spot him within 10 feet and have to laugh it off. But another voice in my head kept whispering, asterisk, what if you don't? What if he's in trouble? Asterisk. I stepped out of the tent, turning in a slow circle with the flashlight. Still no sign of him. I called out Eric's name, softly at first, not wanting to wake Dave unless I absolutely had to. I circled the campsite, aiming the light into the trees. Still nothing but shadows. My gut twisted into a knot. I I called his name louder. That's what woke Dave. I heard his tent rustling, then the zipper, and he stuck his head out, blinking up at me, hair sticking up all over. He asked what was going on. I told him I thought Eric was missing. At first, Dave figured he'd just gone off to take a leak, but once he saw the look on my face, he got serious fast. Dave threw on his jacket and boots, and we split up to search wider around the campsite, calling Eric's name as we went. My flashlight caught trunks and bushes, but nothing else. When we circled back together, Dave suggested maybe Eric had been sleepwalking. Apparently, he used to do it as a kid and had once made it all the way out into his backyard. I wasn't convinced, but we agreed to stick together and widen our search. The forest felt a lot bigger now. The ground sloped downward, roots catching our feet, the cold air soaking into our bones. My hands shook from the chill as I gripped my flashlight. The woods pressed in around us, endless, dark, and confusing. About an hour later, Dave suddenly stopped dead. He pointed his flashlight at a bush. Something gray was snagged there. I swung my light over and felt my stomach drop. It was Eric's old faded cap, the same one he'd been wearing the whole trip, caught on the thorns. We stared at it for a second, frozen. Then Dave said it didn't make sense. We moved forward, still calling his name. About 50 feet ahead, we found his socks. One, then the other, tossed aside like he had peeled them off while walking. Then we found his jeans, crumpled in the dirt, his shirt, his boxers, all laid out along a weird, deliberate path. Neither of us could make any sense of it. Dave asked if I'd seen Eric sneak any liquor. We had finished all the beer our first night, but I had no way of knowing if Eric had hidden a secret bottle of whiskey or something. But even drunk off his ass, he wasn't the kind of guy to pull a stunt like running naked through the woods. We kept arguing about it in whispers, calling his name louder and louder. A minute later, we saw it. Ahead of us, laying on its back in the dirt, was a decapitated body. The blood had soaked the ground around it, pouring from a clean, sharp stump where the head should have been. The body itself looked untouched, pale, almost bluish under our flashlight beams. No cuts, no bruises, just wrong. I froze, couldn't move, couldn't even speak. For a weird moment, my brain refused to believe it was real. It looked fake, like something out of a horror movie. The weird color of the skin, the way the blood had congealed at the neck. It didn't seem real at all. I'd never seen a dead body before. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. Dave reacted the same way. I could see it in his face. At first, he wouldn't even look at the body. He kept pacing, yelling Eric's name into the trees, his voice cracking and getting more desperate. I stayed rooted in place, my flashlight trembling in my hands as the terrible truth sank in. It was Eric. Same height, same build. No scars, no tattoos, it had to be him. And all his clothes were just scattered nearby. I fought to speak, my throat locking up. Finally, I forced the words out. Dave, it's him. It's Eric. Dave shook his head wildly, repeating no over and over. He wouldn't look, just pacing like a madman. Tears spilled down his face as I said it again, louder, angrier. Finally, he broke down, sobbing into his hands. I was